some of the biggest problems that we face, like climate change, bioengineering, AI, et cetera. These are by and large problems that can't be solved on a national basis.
As far as globalism and nationalism are concerned, I think you fall under more of the globalist camp, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I would.
Can you tell me why it is that we can't have a strong nation and still engage in things like global trade and engage globally with other nations, as has been traditionally done? Why, in your opinion, you think it's better to have a more globalized economy and a more globalized citizen, if that's the right term?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on how we're going to define nationalism. So, I mean, I don't have any problem with, say, like patriotism or something, or like, taking pride in one's country, or, seeing a country as a set of concrete ideals that we all sort of unite around. I think there's value to that. And I think it's like pretty cringe when a lot of people on the left will like weirdly, shit on America as like a performative thing or something. So, I mean, I'm all for like, having pride in one's country and so on. I guess when it comes to my aversion to nationalism, it's just going to depend on what we mean by like what would a nationalistic like policy look like, for example, because I would say that I'm in favor of like increasing immigration. I'm in favor of, more global trade because I think it would be economically beneficial. I'm in favor of a more sort of globally integrated system of government, just in virtue of the fact that I think some of the biggest problems that we face, like climate change, bioengineering, AI, et cetera. These are by and large problems that can't be solved on a national basis and require a greater degree of like national integration and cooperation, and like global legislation. So yeah, I guess I would just say like in terms of like policy, where I end up is usually just going to align with what people would consider to be like globalistic, I guess.
Well, so to kind of give you just a little bit of pushback on that, to give you a hypothetical, it's not a likely hypothetical, but it maybe would flesh out your worldview a little bit better. Say, for instance, the United States government could enact a policy, a financial policy that would drastically help with the increase in domestic birth rates, but that would come at the expense of possibly immigrants coming from south of the border for social programs and things like that for them. Would you support the localized policy that would be a national policy to increase our domestic birth rates for our citizens, or would you say that that was a bad policy?
Well, I mean, I certainly support policies that would increase like native fertility. Like I support, for example, like a universal child allowance. I think I have a video of that on my channel where basically I see this big problem with free markets where if you're in a free market and you have if you have a child, that child is purely just going to be a drain on your resources, because children don't produce any income and they cost a lot of money to take care of. And so the result of this, and also you have this additional problem that compounds that, where the age at which most people have children is typically the age where they're going to be making less than they'll make throughout their entire life. Because, usually when people have children, they're in their 20s where they're working entry-level jobs and so on. And this leads to an outcome where, on the one hand, you have people who are not having families that they want to have because they're afraid of going into poverty. And on the other hand, you have people who go through with having those families and then they wind up in poverty as a result. I think those are both pretty morally abhorrent outcomes. And so I support policies that would give people financial support for having children and so on. I guess I'm not sure. I feel like I can advocate for that without necessarily
right. I guess the purpose of the hypothetical wasn't to ask you whether or not you would support domestic birth rates or not, but rather if there was some way financially that the United States government needed to do that at the expense of another nation with our wealth or whatever, would you still support doing that? In other words, the hypotheticals to infer if there was something that was for the good of your own country, but may necessarily come at the expense of another one, even if it's your own money. Would you still support a policy like that? In other words, inferring, would you put maybe your own nation ahead of another nation if push came to shove?
I think that it would depend firstly on how much the policy would benefit the my nation, and secondly, it would depend on how much it would hurt the other country. So like I wouldn't support passing a policy that would like massively harm some other country for like some marginal benefit for my own country. I don't inherently value the well-being of Americans more than the well-being of someone in another country. I basically value all humans, all sentient beings equally in terms of their moral status. So yeah, I guess. But if it were like we could implement a policy that would massively benefit Americans at some like marginal cost to some other country, then I would support that.
So, I guess that's probably as fair of an answer as you can give without a ton of details. I guess it's just kind of my way of seeing if I can flesh out at what the delineation point is before you consider it my people, if you're a globalist, because I think that line is really easy to kind of set if you're a nationalist, right? So if you're an ethno-nationalist, it's probably really easy to set. And if you're a civic nationalist, I think it's also easy to set because you just, you define pretty much everything within the borders of your nation as being your people. The globalist thing, though, that seems like it's a little bit more difficult to define who your people are. I wonder if you can kind of flesh that out for us a little bit.
And are you a globalist, by the way?
I think I probably would consider myself a globalist. In terms of who my people are, well, I mean, if you just mean like what people I want to like look out for, or like what people I value morally and like consider in terms of, what we should be doing, I would say that I value all human life equally. I mean, I just value the pain, suffering, and pleasure of conscious creatures. Whether or not you're living in Africa or in New York, I will value. I'll weigh your moral status equally, right? As a person who has conscious experience and therefore has the capacity to value your own experience, etc.
So an interesting hypothetical that was given to me one time was, if it's your family or somebody else's family first, who do you pick?
I would pick my family. Yeah.
Your family first. So I think the point of that hypothetical was to extrapolate within a country, maybe who's your family, who are your people, who aren't your people. Do you think that it's a fair critique to say that you might care for the people who are within your community and inside of your nation a little bit more than you may care about people who are in other nations that you really, you have a pretty much a disconnect with?
Yeah. Well, I think I would totally understand why somebody would feel that way. And certainly I wouldn't call someone like a bad person for feeling that way or something like that. When it comes to the example about the family, right? I think in general, I would consider myself like some version of like a consequentialist, where like on a basic like sort of moral level, I value everybody's sentience, everybody's conscious experience equally, and I want to do what will make things go best, like on the aggregate for all people, right? Now there's this sort of counter experiment or counter like argument to that sort of a view, where someone's going to say, well, if you could save your mother or two strangers, clearly you should save your mother, not the two strangers, even though like overall you would be causing more suffering than if you would have allowed your mother to die to save the two strangers. And my view on that is that I think that there are certain like heuristics or dispositions that we can cause ourselves to have that are justified on a consequentialist view, because us having that disposition is what makes things go best. So for example, I think things go best when everybody cares about their family, right? Because if I don't care about my mom more than I care about my strangers, then obviously my home life isn't going to be great. I'm not going to have any attachment to my family. And if everybody had that disposition where they just don't care about their mom, then that would be bad in terms of overall consequences. And so I think it's justifiable to value your own family over strangers, because everyone adopting the disposition of prioritizing their own families makes things go best. Now, whether or not that applies to the nationalistic case, I'm not sure. It would just be a question of whether or not things go best when everybody decides to morally prioritize the people of their own country to a greater degree than people of other countries, and whether or not taking up that disposition has a positive impact. I'm not sure. I could see some arguments for why it would. I could see some arguments for why that might cause some degree of harm. I'm not sure.
To steal a line from Omni, right? Intuitively, what would you think?
Well, I partly feel like with respect to nationalism, part of what I mentioned earlier is this idea that all of the biggest sort of existential risks that I think humans face, whether that be AI, biotech, climate change. Climate change isn't that much of an existential threat, but all of the existential threats that we face, and all of the most serious, I think, moral atrocities, I could throw in like the animal agriculture industry. I think that all of these things can most effectively be dealt with, and maybe can only be dealt with on a sort of a globalized basis, where countries are cooperating with one another, creating sort of global legislative power structures, etc. And so I think maybe this view of sort of adopting this disposition where we're prioritizing our own country at the expense of other countries and at the expense of the global community, I think that might be a disposition which is not conducive to making things go best.